Welcome back, Sweet Chris here. In this video, we're going to be covering the CRM module in NetSuite. Now, CRM is not the first thing people think about when they're taking a look at NetSuite. That's definitely not what it's known for. There's a lot of other products out there, Salesforce in particular is one that comes to mind, that do CRM very, very well, and they provide a lot of great functionality as well as a really clean user interface. However, if properly configured, NetSuite does provide a really solid CRM in terms of its functionality and the fact that it's all within the same system. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at NetSuite's CRM module, not from a configuration standpoint, but just from a standpoint of how does it look and operate within the system. And if you're taking a look at CRM, really the first thing you should look at is the lead to quote process flow. Now, it's not like NetSuite has reinvented the wheel on lead to quote, but you should understand how lead to quote operates within NetSuite. So to do that, we're going to take a look at this diagram. And you're going to see that there's really two parallel flows that operate here. The first being the entity records themselves. So the first record we can see here is a lead record, which is any individual or company who is a potential customer. That's pretty obvious. Then it goes on to a prospect record, which is any individual or company who has an active sales cycle. And from there, it goes to an actual customer, who is any individual or company who has bought goods or services from your organization. And the customer record is really the beginning of the order to cash process. At that point, we've bridged the gap over into that process flow. And then on the parallel flow, we have the transaction records. So the first one is the opportunity record, which can be defined as a record of a potential deal or interaction. So it's really documenting that sales process. You then have a quote, which is a document that outlines conditions of a proposed sale. And finally, you have the sales order itself, which is a record of a commitment to buy goods or services. So you've got the entity records on top, and then parallel to that is the transaction records. And those transaction records are really triggers for the entity records, specifically the opportunity and the quote. If either one of those are generated or both, it will actually trigger the lead record to become a prospect record. So it forces that transformation. Similarly, when you have a sales order, it triggers, regardless if you're dealing with a lead or a prospect, by having a sales order attached to that record, it then turns it into a customer, which again, sales order is the beginning of that order to cash process flow. So that's really the simplicity of how this works in NetSuite. The only additional caveat I need to mention is I'm going to be referring to this record as a quote record. However, in native NetSuite, it is called an estimate. The words are synonymous. There's not any particular difference. They just chose to use the word estimate. Most companies end up switching it over to quote, which is what you're going to see in the demo account. Now, before we actually dive into NetSuite, I'm assuming you have some familiarity with NetSuite. However, if you are a totally new user, then you should probably first check out my NetSuite for Beginners video, where I give you some orientation on the system and how to navigate around, so that when you get to this video, we can dive a little bit more into the specifics of the CRM module. However, I should comment that I'm not going to be going deep into CRM in this video. I released a whole NetSuite for Sales Representatives course, and that's where you can get a much more extensive knowledge of how the CRM module works and some of the features that are available for you. So if you're interested in that, you can check out the link in the description below. And with that, let's get started. All right, so here I am in the home dashboard, and I'm currently in a sales manager role. You can see that in the top right. So the first thing we want to take a look at is a lead record. And we could get to that by coming up to leads, relationships, and if I clicked right here, I'd see a listing of all the available leads, and I could select one at random, but in this case, I already have one pulled up. So I'm going to go to my recent records, and I've got this Radiant Services lead, so I'm going to open that record. All right, so hopefully you're somewhat familiar with general entity records and the things that go on them. So I'll try to strictly comment on things that are relevant to a lead record. We obviously have the name at the top. We can specify what is the status of the lead. So qualified and unqualified, those are pretty simple. And in this case, we have a whole host of other prospect related statuses. We can also specify the sales representative if there is one assigned to this particular lead. If not, depending on the sales territory, which can all be set up within the CRM module, it will get divvied out to specific sales territories or even a round robin system as necessary. Down from that, we can set the lead source. So if this is coming from a web form or maybe a trade show, we could select whatever is the relevant lead source. So we're collecting that information about where we're getting our qualified leads from. We obviously have all the contact information, and then we get into the subtabs. Now, I'm not going to dive into the subtabs here because more often than not, when you're looking at a lead record, you're not going to have things such as a bunch of sales information, obviously, because it would otherwise be a prospect or a customer. Relationships, financial, these are all things you'd really see on a prospect or a customer record. So this is the basic concept of a lead record. Now, the communication subtab, you might have, if you've got phone calls or any kind of communication with this particular lead. In this case, you can see we have a task saying that we need to send this lead a quote, which again would transform them into a prospect record. So this could be a relevant tab for this type of record, but really at this point, what we want to do is we want to create an opportunity record attached to this lead so we can really start documenting the sales process with this particular lead. So I could do that by coming up to this new button and creating an opportunity, but that would create a standalone opportunity. In this case, what I want to do is I want to have it linked directly to this lead. So I'm going to come to this new button here, and I'm going to click an opportunity. And it brings us to this opportunity record. Now, it automatically ties in the information from that lead record. So we've got the company name, it's brought in the status, the sales rep. And when we come down to the forecasting, this is where we really get into what are the probabilities of this sale going through. So it's automatically defaulted to 20% based on the status that was set above. It considers that there's a 20% chance this sale could go through in the first place. And the projected total, in other words, what do we think this sale is going to be? We could set it as $1,000. It gives us a range saying from here to here, if there is some kind of wiggle room that you're not totally sure where it will land. You don't have to specify that as different from the projected total, but let's say we think it could go down $800 and potentially they'll buy $1,200 worth. So we can set that range, and then we really delineate what is the forecasting type. So what's the scenario in this case? If this sale is going to go through and there's a 20% chance, do we think that's a worst case scenario? Or potentially that's a best case scenario, and you're going to see later that this is going to come back into play. So if we come down here, we can see this is where we can actually start adding the line items for this opportunity. And there might not be any line items at this particular point. You might know that there's only a potential for a sale here, but you haven't actually described what product or in what quantities. But if you have described and they have gone over it, they might have told you that they need some monitors and they're looking at buying 50 monitors for their company. So you could put in that information. If they also needed, let's say, servers, you could add that. However many line items is required to put in the information that you think might be part of this sale. So let's save this opportunity. And we can see we now have an in-progress opportunity. And this now comes into play when we're looking at the forecasted sales for this particular sales rep. Right now we're looking at Will Clark. So let's actually take a look at the forecast editing tool so we can see how these figures play out. If we come up here to forecast and down to setup, we have this edit sales rep forecast. So let's click on that. And it brings us to this tool. So here's where we're going to set the subsidiary, and we're going to pick a sales rep. So I'm sales manager Joel Williams, so I have my 3 sales representatives available, and I'm going to select Will Clark. So it's going to pull in all of Will Clark's information, and we can look at Will's projected sales for, in this case, we're looking at the month of May. We could select a different time period as needed. So the way this works is if we come down here, we've got all these different tabs, and you can see it starts with opportunities, then any quotes that Will has, unbilled orders, and actuals. So kind of the whole gamut of potential sales that this sales rep has are all included here. And then all of those figures, the values for each one, are weighted against the probability to come out with a full projection. And the reason the weighting is in effect is because up here we have forecast as weighted turned on. You don't have to do that, but in most cases you're going to want that so that if there's only a 10% chance of having a sale, it's going to be recorded with that 10% in mind. It's not going to take the full potential value of that sale. And when we look at opportunities, you can see this is the one that we just created with Radiant Software Services. We can see it's in discussion. There was a 20% probability of it happening. And it adds up the full, remember we added those line items for 50 monitors and a server. So those came out to 23,000. But we set the actual sale that we were looking at. We thought it was most likely to happen at $1,000 with the worst case at $800 and the best case scenario at $1,200. So these figures, in other words, this $1,000 times 20% because it's weighted, and there was another similar one just above it, which was again 1,000 times 20%, that totals into this $400 that we're actually forecasting just for opportunities. And then it doesn't look like he currently has any quotes, but he does have unbilled orders worth of $2,000 and no actuals. So these figures then get added up to display here, where we can see the most likely is $2,400. That's the 400 plus the 2,000 in unbilled orders. But then the worst case scenario is only 2,360, and the upside goes to 2,440. Now, the difference between this row here and the override is the fact that we can actually change, we can manually change these numbers. If we know that the worst case scenario is actually only $1,400, and maybe we want to change the upside to be significantly higher, we can put it at 4,440. So that gives us a broader spectrum if we have reason to believe that what was already projected was not going to be completely accurate. We could override it with these figures. And this tool is just being used for sales representatives, but we are able, if you are in a role that has permission to do so, you can come up to the forecast and look at this same tool, but for sales managers. So you can see the whole team in this case. So that's the basic concept for lead records, opportunities, and forecasting. Now, there are still prospect records and quotes, but a lot of the mechanics of those forms are very similar to what we just saw with leads and opportunities. So for the sake of this video, I'm not going to dive into that. We're going to go straight to the next major stage, which is really getting into order to cash, starting with the customer record. So let's pull up a customer record now. In this case, I have one recently pulled up here with Ultima, and I'm going to go into edit mode on this record. So I'll hit leave on this current page. Okay, and it brings us to this record. Now, again, I am assuming you have some familiarity with NetSuite, so I'm not going to talk about everything that's on this record, but there's a few specific tabs and tools that I think are important to know, and many users are not aware that they have these tools available to them in NetSuite. So going down to the subtab region, I already commented on the communications subtab, but the sales tab is where we can see all the different transaction related records that tie into this particular customer. So coming down here, we can see we're on the transaction sublist, and you can see we've got item fulfillment, sales orders, returns, everything I just mentioned, including the lead to quote things such as quotes, etc. We've got the values for them. We can even click on these dates if we want to pull up the specific records that are being referenced here. But going back to that customer record, if we come up here, the next tab I want to show you is relationships. So this is where we can start recording what are our contact points within this customer. So if it's a full company, there might be a purchasing manager is the person that we're actually in communication with. That's where we want to specify that. So we don't want just an email for the entire company. We want to know what is the email for Joe Jones, which is our contact point in Ultima Technology. Over from that, we have financial. This is where we can record a lot of the basic information on this customer. And I'm going to talk about in a little bit specifically price levels and how that comes into play. And then lastly, I want to go way over to the right here. We have this Customer 360 tab. So if we click on that, it is basically a very useful tool that gives you a lot of quick information about the purchasing behavior of this particular customer. So we've got all these sublists here that give us just different angles on this customer. We can see the 12-month sale that Ultima has done by month. We can come over here, we can see the top items sold. In other words, what is Ultima buying most frequently from our organization? So we can see a full breakdown of all our products that they've bought, as well as in what quantity and in what value. We've got a customer scorecard that gives us kind of the gamut of how many things have they bought, how many things have we fulfilled, how often do they return, what's their year-to-date sales compared to last year, just a bunch of information on that. And we've got a number of other tabs that all just take another aspect of this customer's purchasing history with our organization. But if you want to take a look at a lot of information in one place, let's say you call up Ultima Technology, you want to sell them, you want to be able to not have to navigate through subtabs, but just have one page with everything laid out for you. And the best way to do that is actually coming at the top here. You can see we have this little dashboard odometer symbol, and if we click on that, it pulls up a customer dashboard, which, much like your own home dashboard, is a single page with portlets that really gives you that bird's eye view of Ultima Technology. So we can see on the left-hand side here, this portlet just gives all the basic information about Ultima, their contact info, our contact points within them, and then we can put whatever portlets we want here on the right. So in this case, we're looking at their key performance indicators. You could have a saved search pulled up that shows all of their most recent transactions, how much they were for, and when they should be due to purchase their next item from our organization. So you can also configure this just like you would in your normal dashboard. You can personalize it, add additional portlets, take ones off, customize them. You can modify the layout, whatever you want to do. Just keep in mind that this customer dashboard and however you configure it will apply not just to Ultima, but to any customer that you're pulling up. And that's it for the customer dashboard. The next thing I want to talk about is pricing and what are your pricing options. Well, most of the pricing information is going to be stored on the item record. And that makes sense because if you're dealing with a widget, then the pricing is really going to revolve around that widget. So let's pull up a specific item just so we can get a visual on what this looks like. If I come over here, I've recently had this inventory item, and I'm going to pull this up. This is that Dell monitor I was earlier referencing. So we can see this is a 24-inch LED monitor. And if we come down to the sales pricing subtab, all the way to the bottom here, we have a whole section on pricing. So the way this works in NetSuite, they've organized pricing in these sort of tiers. And really the lowest level is what's called a base price. And you can see that right here. The base price is simply with no additions, what does this item cost? If you want to buy a monitor, regardless of any other circumstance, this monitor would cost $350. So that's the very low base price. Up from that, you have what's utilized the most common is the price levels tier. And the way price levels work, and you can see that here, we've got all of these price levels. These are literal levels that you set. And you can see in this case, these price levels are really oriented around what type of customer you have. So is it a new customer? Is it a retailer? Is it a wholesaler? Depending on the type of customer, they gain access to a certain price level. So you can see the base price is $350. New customers get a little discount, but if you're a wholesaler, you're getting a major discount on that price. And the way this really sets up is the item will have these price levels set. And then once you have the price levels set on the item, you then have the customer record where you delineate what type of customer is this and what price level are they going to access. So if we come back to our Ultima Technology record and we come down to the financial tab, as I pointed out before, we can set here what price level does Ultima have. So here we can see we're considering Ultima a new customer. So if they were to purchase a Dell monitor, they would get the price of $300. So that's the first tier, which is called price levels. Up from that, you have group pricing. And I'm not going to go deep into this, but the basic concept is it's really like another layer where you can say, if price levels are not complicated enough to fulfill our needs, we're going to add another layer where we can specify that certain items or certain types of items have a particular pricing, and the customers have to match up with that group pricing to gain access to those prices. So that's the second tier. tier. And then the third tier at the top is what's called item pricing. And item pricing gets even more into the minutia, where they're saying for a particular customer, if they're buying this one particular item, we're going to give them a very specific price for that. And when you're looking at this tier system, it really goes in order of seniority. So if there's an item pricing set, it's going to go with the item pricing. If there's no item pricing, it goes down to group pricing. And then if there's no group pricing, it goes down to either price levels or just down to the base level if nothing else has been set. So it's always looking at the highest level to see if it can apply it, and then it moves down in terms of seniority. Again, price levels are by far the most commonly used, and that's really that first level just above the base price. So that's pricing. And just to give you a concept of where some of that information lies, we saw that we have the price level here, and then you can access group pricing and item pricing down in these sublists. The next logical thing to talk about is payment methods. And just to give you a little orientation to that, if I come up to the recent records, I have this invoice with Ultima. So if I pulled up this invoice and I go to it, we can see this is an open invoice, and I've got the option right here to accept a payment. And if I click on that, it's going to take us to a payment record, right? It branches that off of the invoice so we can actually record the payment for this invoice. And if I scroll down on this record, we have the payment method subtab. This is where we can record what type of payment method is being used, whether credit card, cash, check, etc., and all the information that goes along with that. So NetSuite does have the capability of handling payment methods within the system, but most NetSuite clients tend to go with a third-party payment processor. There's things like Square, Stripe, Global Payments. There's a lot of different options out there that do payment processing better than NetSuite. NetSuite has limitations both from a legality standpoint as well as just how their system works in terms of handling payment processing. So if you have very simple requirements, you might find that NetSuite fills those requirements fine, but oftentimes, especially if you're doing a lot of transactions or anything that's a bit more complicated, you're going to tend to go with something like Stripe as opposed to trying to utilize NetSuite's own system. I could comment, however, on the fact that if you've set in the payment information, you are able to come over here and apply it, not just to this invoice that we were previously on, but the system takes a look at everything related to Ultima technology and proposes additional invoices that you could pay all at once. In this case, there's one additional invoice, and I could select apply on that as well, in which case it totals these figures and allows me to record that payment. Of course, you would need the customer permission before doing so. Now, there's a couple last things I want to show you related to the CRM functionality, and one of them is the activities. So activities, we can see up in this tab here. When we say activities, we're talking about three things: events, tasks, and phone calls. Any one of these three things can be tied to any type of record, whether an entity record or a transaction record. Similar to how I showed you, you can take a lead record and generate an opportunity off of that. You can come to this customer record and you could go to create new, and let's say you want to generate a new phone call. You could simply click this and put in the basic information in terms of what call you need to generate, at what time, who needs to be involved, what's their phone number. All of this information you can store in this additional record. And once you save that, you would be able to find it down here in the communication. So just like I have a quote saved here, that phone call would line up, and you can add a calendar portlet to your home dashboard that shows you all of your activities, whether they're events, calls, or tasks, and how they break down by time, seniority, all of these different things. Many customers choose to use a different system such as Notion or Monday. There's a lot of other options out there to do this type of activity function, but you have that option within NetSuite. If you don't want to go out to a third-party app, you have that feature right there for you. And the last thing I want to comment on is the reporting tools that are available to you, specifically related to CRM. So as I've commented on other videos looking at the various reporting tools, there's three main reporting tools in NetSuite: Reports, Saved Searches, and Suite Analytics. Now, all of these are accessible. If you come up here on your center, you can see we have a Reports subtab, and we've got all of these different reports listed out you can see everything from customer and receivables to sales, sales orders, just dozens and dozens of pre-made reports that you can access and see if they fit your exact requirements. Generally, if you're finding the reports that are off the shelf don't fit what you're looking for, that's where you want to move into saved searches. And that's where, if you come up here, you can create either a new search or have an already generated search saved here where you can easily access it. And saved searches are a very robust tool. I have many videos that cover how to set up those searches, but you can really dig into every type of parameter that you might need to know what kind of leads you should be tracking and selling to. All of those capabilities are within saved searches. And if you want to take advantage of some of the Suite Analytics capabilities, I have additional videos just on Suite Analytics. And if you come up here, this is where you would access the ability to create new Suite Analytics. Just to give you an example of what one of those looks like, if we go back to our home dashboard, this is a perfect example of a Suite Analytics, which they give a lot more visual and graphical representations than you can find with saved searches. So if you are a sales representative, you might not be setting these things up yourself, but you can always go to a consultant or an administrator and give them your exact requirements to provide you with these types of portlets and searches that you can put on your home dashboard for easy access. And that's your high-level view of the CRM module in NetSuite. If you want more training or information about it, be sure to check out my NetSuite for Sales Representatives course. And if you found this video helpful, hit that like button, subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and I'll see you next time.